Okay, so I'll start recording now. So hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming to the first ever Change Maker speaker series, where we aim to provoke conversation that matter. May I first remind everyone to please keep their cameras off and their mics muted for the duration of the talk. If you do have questions though, Joe has kindly agreed to kind of answer on an ad hoc basis, so you can just raise your hand or something. Basically, now I just want to introduce you to the reason we're all here, Dr. Joe Devlin from UCL. So happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody and sort of share, I guess, what amounts to a very personal story about how my career has developed. Habib, but just for admin purposes, you're happy to admit people?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Then I will turn that window off so that I don't get distracted by it.
Okay.
I thought I would take the opportunity to, as I say, give you a bit of a personal journey. So do this slightly informally, and I titled my talk "A Circuitous Route to Success" because I'm not always sure that it's been as linear and straightforward as it sometimes appears on paper. And I'm not always so sure it's a true success or not, and I'll let you guys decide. So I was thinking about it, and when I think about my sort of professional biography, I did my PhD at University of Southern California, and then I took a postdoc in Cambridge here in the UK. I had a second postdoc over at Oxford before I got my first academic post in Oxford. And then I came to UCL in about 2007, where among other things, I've been head of psychology and I'm now vice dean. And when you put it in that kind of a frame, it sounds successful. And it also sounds very straightforward, like, oh, that's a clear path that makes a ton of sense. But what's fascinating to me is that's not the way it feels in my head, right? So when I think about it, that's what I can write down in a little bio, but that doesn't really reflect my path. So what I thought I'd do is tell you a little bit about my personal career journey without sugarcoating anything. So some of the good, some of the bad, in an effort to reflect how I got here and whether it's really where I ever intended to be. So to just put that in context, I'm going to go back to like being about 10 years old, because I remember at that time, either my mom or my dad said to me that lawyers made a lot of money. I have no idea how that came up. I was a little kid, but I remember thinking, I want to be a lawyer, right? Because I want to make a lot of money. I want to fly in first class planes. I'd never flown on a plane, but it just seemed like a good idea when I was 10. And that was my plan all the way through university. So you can see already, I'm not a lawyer. And as an academic, I'm probably not making a ton of money relative to lawyers either. So again, just from the beginning, I think we can sort of accept that perhaps this isn't the path that I always intended. But to just think about it, when I went to university, I had every intention of being a lawyer. So I asked, what kind of degrees do you need in order to study law? And pretty universally, when I was talking to colleges, and this is in the US, they said, well, you can study anything before you study law, because at law school we'll teach you the law. In fact, you should do whatever you want. Music is a great degree. And I can't even remember how many of them told me music is really good if you're going to be a lawyer. And I have no idea why to this day, but I have no musical talents whatsoever. So I studied computer science and just went to a whole lot of gigs when I was at university, right? That was my contribution to the music side of things. I studied computer science because I was just a geek, and nothing's really changed there. But what did change was that by the end of college, I didn't really want to be a lawyer anymore, right? So, so I had to sort of rethink what my career path was, since my plans from 10 until 21 had pretty much already fallen apart. As a sort of lifelong science fiction fan, I was really interested in AI. So I went to University of Southern California to do a PhD in artificial intelligence. So continuing with my geek roots, I ended up in Los Angeles studying computing even further. And one of the things I discovered was that I had done a liberal arts education in the US, not a very technical one. So I was grossly unprepared for my PhD program. I don't know whether other people have the same experience, but in my program of 120, 130 PhD students, I was dead last in terms of the number of computing and math classes I had ever had, by a lot. I think I'd had 12 computer and math classes as an undergrad, and the next lowest had 27. So I was spinning a bit when I got into graduate school. And one of the things that was really helpful for me was a lot of my friends from graduate school were enormously beneficial. So I remember in my program, there were three guys, Mike and Gaurav and Sanjay, who were so helpful and patient and generous with their time to try to help get me up to some of the technical levels, which was just lovely of them. But in addition, I had friends in the sort of neuroscience area, particularly in neurobiology, which I was also trying to study. And I just had no biology. And there was a woman named Liz who was just immensely generous in terms of trying to help get me through. So one of my key memories from graduate school was that some of the friends that I developed at the time, who are still friends of mine today, were enormously beneficial to both my academic career, but also like my mental health, because for that first year, I was incredibly anxious and nervous about graduate school and whether or not I had what it took to actually perform at graduate school. And then once I got a little bit under my belt and started to understand what was expected and learned a little bit more, things became a little bit easier. But the other thing about graduate school was I went to work with a guy named Michael Arbib, who was one of the real pioneers in computational neuroscience, which is something I was really interested in. Michael didn't take me on as a student. And so my whole plan was I go to USC, I'm going to work for Michael, and that fell apart within about the first 6 months, which also was a bit devastating. And he had lots of good reasons, not least of which was he had an enormous lab and he just didn't have the resources at the time. But he did put me in touch with Mark Seidenberg, who's a psychologist, who was at the time using artificial neural networks, what now has been sort of rebranded as deep learning, to investigate human psychology using these kind of computational mechanisms. And Mark took me on as a student. And I would say for the vast majority of that time, that worked really well. So Mark was incredibly generous and helpful. He had us over his house a lot and spent a lot of time with us. So he was a good supervisor. But one of the things I discovered is when I went to conferences, Mark was also incredibly cantankerous. Like he liked to pick fights, not physical fights. He just, intellectual fights about the nature of cognition, and he would ask really hard questions. And graduate students from other labs would always be like, "How can you work with that guy?" Right? I mean, he had a real reputation as being a difficult character, which I hadn't even seen until I'd gone to a conference. And it was interesting. I mean, because it shed a new light on him that turns out to be an accurate light. I mean, I'd say that Mark is a character in all senses of the word, and we're friends and we get along well, but we've had our moments, and I'll come to one of them. But I'm like, for instance, he would be willing to ask really hard questions. So one of the things he said to me, he called me into his office one day, middle way through my PhD, and said, "Dude, what kind of job do you think you're ever going to get? I mean, you're not really a computer scientist, even though you're studying computing, and you're certainly not a psychologist. Who do you think is going to hire you?" And I remember being absolutely gutted. I mean, it was a perfectly legitimate question to ask, but it caused a real crisis of confidence, thinking, "Oh my God, I don't know who would hire me." And I should point out that this was in the mid-90s when there weren't neuroscience departments. That wasn't a thing yet. So it was one of those moments that sort of shaped my thinking, and I didn't have an answer for it at the time. And as you'll see, my answer has evolved over the years, but we'll come to that. One of the things that was awesome about Mark, though, was that he was very generous in terms of introducing you to people. So he encouraged us to present our research at conferences and meet people. And I remember the first conference I ever went to was a neuropsych meeting somewhere in Arizona. And after the session, there was one of those wine and cheeses in the evening. And I happened to be like the first person at the bar, which probably in hindsight is not surprising. But I had picked up drinks for like all my friends, and literally my hands were full of drinks when Mark came walking over to me with Carolyn Patterson, who happened to be sort of one of those academic idols of mine. I was doing a lot of work based on Carolyn's stuff, and he wanted to introduce me. And I was absolutely mortified because I had both my hands full of alcohol. I couldn't shake her hand, and I looked like a total boozer. So, so there are these kind of interesting events that happen at conferences. Years later, I got to know Carolyn pretty well, and I reminded her of the incident, and she couldn't remember it at all. And she just bust out laughing and said, "You know what? I probably didn't even notice, but if I had, I probably would have thought, yeah, he's my kind of guy." So it took on more significance in my head than it probably did in hers, and I think that that's kind of characteristic. But the other thing about graduate school was the way I was doing it is I was being a teaching assistant. So I was getting paid £9,500 a year, or dollars, excuse me, a year to live in Los Angeles, which is not much. I mean, we survived, but it was not much. And towards the end of my PhD, when I would have been in the equivalent of CRS status, my funding ran out. And I had to leave USC without my PhD and take a job in industry just to pay the bills. So at the time I moved to Ohio because I was in a long distance relationship, and that's where my girlfriend was. And I got a job doing IT because that was about all I really thought I was capable of doing. And one of the questions they asked me at interview was, well, what salary do you expect? And I was totally unprepared for that question. I had no idea. Making less than $10,000 a year, I boldly asked for a crazy amount of money and said, I'd like to make $25,000 a year, which I got the job and they gave me that salary. And a few months later, because I had the best boss in the world at the time, he pulled me aside and said, "Just so you know, dude, you are really being underpaid in this role. They took total advantage of the fact you had no idea what salary." So just as a top tip, anytime you go into a job interview, you should be prepared for the question, what salary do you expect? And you need to do the research in advance to find out what's appropriate and what you can ask for. And I wish I had known that because I thought I was making a ton at the time, but that wasn't the case. And it would have been good to know. In any event, what I found was while I was trying to do my PhD part-time to finish off, I just wasn't getting it done, right? 18 months passed and I had maybe written 2 chapters out of 6 or 7. And ultimately I realized I had to stop my job and just work on the thesis full-time. So I did that. I quit my job and I spent 8 weeks just writing the rest of my thesis. And they were a horrendous 8 weeks. I mean, I don't think writing your thesis is a good time anyway, but doing it under a lot of pressure like that was awful. And the girlfriend had at that time become my wife, and our marriage broke down, and my relationship with Seidenberg broke down really badly. It was an unpleasant time, to the extent that when I did my Viva, when it was done, what I felt was relief more than anything. I wasn't happy. I certainly wasn't elated. I had seen lots of people who were just stoked when they got done. And that wasn't my feeling at all. I just felt like, wow, that's good. I'm glad that's done. And again, I just think, I wish I had known that that wasn't uncommon. Lots of people felt that way because what I expected certainly wasn't what I experienced. But I also felt like maybe this academic gig isn't for me, right? I hated this. I wasn't that happy. But I had spent about 7.5 years getting a PhD. I thought I might as well do my postdoc and give it a fair shot, right? So I left my IT job. I took up a job as a postdoc at the time it was at Birkbeck, right? So I'd gotten this postdoc position with Lolly Tyler's group, but between being hired and when I actually arrived, she and her lab moved to Cambridge. So again, it wasn't exactly what I expected. I never expected to be a postdoc at Cambridge. I got hired by Birkbeck, but the lab moved, so then I got moved over to Cambridge, which was nice. And it was another case of working with a character. Lolly is one of these people who's incredibly socially skilled and very bright woman and strong-minded. And what I found was that in the 2 years that we worked together, we didn't really work together that well. I didn't enjoy that postdoc. So by the end of those 2 years, I was thinking, I really am not cut out for academia. I don't see people that represent role models that I want to be. So I was thinking it was time to move back to the US and get another job. But unfortunately, during that time, I had had some really cool opportunities. So I had the opportunity to learn something about neuroimaging, and this is in the late 90s, so very, very early days, both positron emission tomography and fMRI. And among other things, Lolly sent me over to the Phil at UCL, where I met Kathy Price and Carl Friston, who I didn't know either of them at the time. I didn't know anything about them. And I got this kind of one-to-one 3-hour personal tutorial when I arrived from two of the most amazing minds in the field. And of course, I was so ignorant, I had no idea that this was special and lucky, but it really did sort of awaken an interest in the area. And you know, I've been using those kind of tools now for 20 some years. And in fact, about a year later, Kathy and I started dating, and we've been married now for about 20 years. So this was a super lucky event in my life, both academically and personally, that happened during this otherwise challenging postdoc. But by the end of the postdoc, I was convinced, yep, I don't want to be an academic. This isn't a lifestyle I like. I don't like the people in academia. I don't want to be those kind of people. If I was, I would be unhappy. But the one thing that sort of changed that a little bit was at the very end of my time, I got involved in a project with the Imaging Center at Oxford that was led by a guy named Paul Matthews. And although I had never met Paul, I had done a little scanning there. He rang me up one day. I'd sent him a draft of a paper. He rang me up one Thursday afternoon, and he spent an hour going through that paper with me and making suggestions and being just lovely and friendly and supportive. And I just thought, wow, that's impressive. And what he said at the very end of the conversation was, look, if you're ever thinking about, you know, looking for another role, give me a call, because, you know, you might fit in well over here. And this was just very, very random from my perspective, because of course I was leaving my current postdoc, and I said to him, wow, it's funny you should say that, because I'm done here. I am looking for another role. And he said, oh, well, look, we have a postdoc opportunity coming up, but we're interviewing tomorrow. Can you be here at 9:30 to interview? And I did. I got the post. He called me that evening, and I got the postdoc. And I moved from Cambridge to Oxford, again, completely unplanned, right? So it was just the luck of bumping into these people at the right time and having these opportunities that brought me to these kind of posts. And what was fascinating for me was I got to work with Paul Matthews and a guy named Matthew Rushworth. And these are two people who I just have so much respect for. They're both outstanding scientists. They're both outstanding people. And suddenly I had role models, or people that I could look at and say, oh, that is the kind of scientist I would like to be. And that changed my perspective a little bit. One of the things that was good, though, was that Paul also wasn't afraid to ask hard questions. So one of the things that Paul said to me at one point, he called me into his office and said, Joe, you write good papers, but they're boring. And you're not getting them into high impact journals. What are you going to do to change that? And I was pretty offended. And I sort of stomped out of his office and thought, I write science papers, right? These are good scientific papers. They're not those crappy high impact journal papers that are more story than science. But that conversation bumped around in my head for about 6 months, really, before I sort of saw it slightly differently and realized what he was saying was, there's two aspects of writing a paper. One is getting the science right, and one is getting the communications right. And that I was almost solely focused on the former and not focused on the latter at all. And that was one of those pivotal moments in my academic career, because it changed my thinking about how you write a paper. And after that, my papers were far more effective at getting into better journals. They were also noticed better, and they were cited more. And in some ways, I grew up as a scientist as a result of that conversation, because it made me mature in my thinking about what we do with science communication. It's not about sort of ticking a box and showing that you've done everything right and good and well. It's about communicating the information to others and making it accessible. And of course, that requires that you do all those other things too. But the second component is this aspect of science communication. And for whatever reason, I was 10 years into my career before I even realized that. So I have enormous respect and admiration for Paul. He was also a very good leader, and I learned a lot working for him that I've had the opportunity to since apply myself. But what happened after that was I started writing better papers. I got a chance to get a Wellcome Career Development Award, and I got my first academic job, and that was at Cambridge. And I had an appointment in clinical neurology. So I would literally be sitting in these meetings with academics talking about managing headaches and multiple sclerosis and things like that, thinking Seidenberg was right. I don't know how I'm in this meeting. I'm certainly not a clinical neurologist. What the hell is happening in my career? But by the same token, I had a job. I felt like I was doing things well. And for the first time, really, I guess I felt like maybe I was suited to academic life. And this is maybe 10 years after my PhD was over, right? So it was maybe not, maybe it's 5 years after that. But nonetheless, it had taken a while to get to that point. Amusingly, at that point, Paul Matthews got an offer from Imperial and moved, and the new director of the Imaging Center, which is where I was based, called me into her office and said, the kind of work you do is really interesting, but it's totally not the stuff we're interested in this center, and I assume you'll be leaving us soon. So that changed things again. The good news is at the time, UCL had just gotten a new MRI scanner down in Bedford Way in the psychology building, and they were looking for a director. Now, I was too junior to be a director, but I applied for it anyway because it just sounded like a good opportunity. And my friend, Fred Dick, who was a guy who I had met as a graduate student at a conference in California somewhere, we had stayed in touch. And Fred let me know about it, and I applied for the job and didn't get it. It went to Marty Serino, who was a much better director for the Imaging Center than I was. But I got a post at UCL as an assistant director and a member of psychology. And it went well, right? I mean, I was producing fairly well. I was getting lots of papers out. I was not good at grant writing. I've never been good at grant writing. So it's something I still feel anxiety about to this day. I got that one big grant from the Wellcome, and I've had lots of little things, but I've applied to maybe 20 major grants and gotten just one. So it's not the case that everybody can do everything, and it's clearly not a strength of mine. I'd love to have that one back. I'd love to know why other people are better at writing grants than I am. But to this day, I'm still not that good at it. What I found was after about 6 years at UCL, so this is, I've been here for a little while and things were going well, I was also getting a bit restless. And one of my colleagues, Shelley Channon, said to me, look, our head of department stepping down, maybe you should apply for that and try something new. She basically said, look, you complain a lot when things don't go right. So maybe you should step up and put your money where your mouth is, right? And I thought it was fair. Again, another good comment, solid comment from a person who I truly respect. And I applied for the job and got it, which was fun for a ton of different reasons. One, it just re-energized me. Like I started to learn how universities function and in ways that I had never understood as just an academic working in a university. And there was a ton of new challenges, new learning that I loved. But the other thing was I was head of a psych department, despite the fact I had never had a psychology class in my life. And now I was thinking, Seidenberg, take that, right? I mean, now I've got a good job. You know, it felt great. It was a new investment. The other thing that was going on at the time, and this is where I'll sort of end things, was that as one of the directors of the Imaging Center, we'd get a ton of corporate interest. You know, companies would come to us and say things like, can you use an MRI machine to prove that pudding makes your brain happy? Or can we record the dreams of celebrity chefs and then just project them out at an architectural scale for everyone to see? And what about my personal favorite was, we'd like to bring a live tiger into the scanner room with somebody in the scanner to show what anxiety in the brain looks like. So we got these completely wackadoo approaches on a regular basis, and I was the person who dealt with them. But amusingly, at one point, an advertising campaign company came to me, and they wanted to do something that was far more sensible. They wanted to use some brain imagery in an advertising campaign without making scientific claims. And I worked with them on it. And what I learned from that was that there are a ton of super, super smart, dedicated, interested people out there in the business world who are really interested in psychology and neuroscience, but don't know where to get the information, right? Like they only get the pop stuff and they don't communicate with us and they don't know how to approach us. And for me, this was a real transformative moment because it shifted a lot of my own research from very ivory tower neurobiology of language to how you could use psychology and neuroscience in the real world And I've been doing that ever since. So I stepped down as head of department to take up the Vice Dean of Innovation and Enterprise role, because that allowed me to work on building these academic corporate partnerships. And I mean, I could talk about that all day, because that's a topic that I'm really passionate about. And I think it's fascinating, and it brings an awful lot of benefits to both sides, but they're hard to do. And it's understandable why they're hard. We speak different languages, we have different time frames, we have different goals. All that being said, when you do it and when you can manage them, the opportunities there are fantastic. And I think many of you will have heard Daniel Richardson talk about some of them earlier today, so I won't really go into it. But that's basically my story, how I went from being a 10-year-old wannabe lawyer to vice dean at UCL. And you can see that all the transitions make sense, but every one of them was random, right? They weren't planned. And they were a result of this almost kind of pinball-like action of bumping off of opportunities or people when there was a chance. And suddenly my career shifted directions. And for me, I've been incredibly fortunate with that. There's been a ton of uncertainty, but there's also been a ton of luck. And if you're a fan of Richard Wiseman's work, you know, in Reading, the psychologist who's done awesome work on what luck is basically the opportunity, the recognition of an opportunity and the ability to respond to it. And I've been very fortunate to have these opportunities and have the chance to respond and take these pinball movements off in different directions of my career. I got to say, I'm still not sure that academia is for me, despite the fact that I'm a professor at UCL and I'm very, very happy with my job. I mean, it has lots of advantages and lots of disadvantages. 22 years after I left industry, I'm just now earning more than I was when I left industry. Okay, so it's not the route to riches. And they always say, yeah, you don't go into academia if you want to be rich. But maybe people don't recognize how true that is. There's an enormous opportunity cost to that. So I am not a rich lawyer, as I expected to be by the ripe old age of 50 or whatever. But I am very happy in my job. But I realistically, when I look around, I think, it may be the case that the opportunities that exist in terms of using psychology and neuroscience in real life may very well cause my path to careen again in an unknowable direction. And that seems totally plausible to me. Or I could stay in academia for the rest of my career and be happy with that. So I don't know what the future holds. And I don't know that I've necessarily found my place, but I've made do with everything I've had, and I've enjoyed it very much. And hopefully that gives you a sense of a random career trajectory. And I'm absolutely happy to take any questions anybody has.
This is Pam speaking. Can you hear me?
Oh, hi, Pam.
Hi, how are you doing?
Yeah, really well, thanks.
Yeah, it's really great to hear about your experiences. So like you mentioned, I talked to Daniel earlier, actually. So I'm sorry for everyone to have to hear this question twice, if you were in that talk also. But he told me to actually ask you about this because you would know a lot better. So it's actually a question about consumer neuroscience. So in that field, there's a lot of organizations nowadays using brain imaging techniques to advertise their, to test, I'm using air quotes here, and advertise the effectiveness of their products. So for example, showing a group of participants a trailer movie and saying that predicts, how well the movie is actually received when it's being released. So my question is that how much of that is true? What can neuroscience test and what can it not test? So yeah, I just want to hear how much we can actually believe what they're saying and selling.
Right. That is an absolutely huge question. So Daniel and I run these workshops that we cover that over like 16 hours or something. But in a nutshell, I think that what's commercially available from companies at the moment, as a rule, isn't based on very good science. So for instance, there are neuromarketing companies that use what's known as frontal alpha asynchrony with EEG to measure emotional responses in people watching ads or movies or whatever it is. And I would say that the evidence behind the legitimacy of that is poor. It's shaky at best. But companies are still doing it, and they're paying top dollar for it. And I've talked to a lot of the companies that run these things, and they believe in it. They just don't understand the science very well. Having said that, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for really good science. And part of what's been fun about running these workshops is identifying those examples. So for instance, there is a company in Japan. Learning English is a really important aspect of being a successful business person because so much business occurs in English, right? But of course, it's famously difficult for Japanese people to hear that RL distinction, and that causes all sorts of problems because it just doesn't exist in Japanese. And one group that was teaching English did a really, really cool study using what's called the mismatch negativity with ERPs. And there's a ton of word pairs in English, like right, light, that they only differ in terms of the R and the L. But some of them are easier to hear the difference, and some of them are harder. And what they did was they took these word pairs and they put it into a proper mismatch negativity experiment, and they identified like how much of a brain response you got for hearing the difference. And you get a larger difference if it's an easier word. So they then said, look, these are all the words that are relatively easy to hear. These are the ones that are kind of a little bit harder to hear. And then these are the ones that are super hard to hear. So they took all the easy words into the beginning of their training. And as you got good at those, you then move on to the harder words. And so they basically designed their product around really good, clever use of neuroscience. And there are a surprisingly large number of examples like that indicate that if you target the specific question that you have with the right set of tools and a proper approach, you can do really well. Most of the stuff that we see making the news is just crap, right? And normally it makes the news because it's crap and we're just sort of making fun of it. And there's tons of fun examples of that. But I think that there's a surprisingly large amount of good work that can be done, and not limited to neuroscience. I mean, you see a lot of it in behavioral science with, Nudge and behavioral insights team and things like that. We run a webinar series over lockdown where we got a lot of people from the business world talking about how they use behavioral science, neuroscience in their work. And I found it really inspirational to listen to a lot of these talks because people are using the science that we talk about in legitimate ways to solve real world problems. And that makes me very encouraged.
Okay, great. Very interesting to hear. I guess when do you know, like what is it that set it out that, oh, we can trust what they're testing or not?
Yeah, amusingly, I wrote a blog post about this. I wrote the 5 warning signs of snake oil neuromarketing. And the things that I identify as, first of all, are they doing the same thing all the time? If you only have one tool and you're using it no matter what the question is, it's probably a warning sign. The other is, do they actually have people who have training in the science? Like often you get somebody who's literally a doctor, like a GP, who's had in like a neurology class in year 2 of med school, and they're their scientific advisor, and that's worrying. Do they publish the methods, right? So a lot of these companies, they basically say, well, these are proprietary methods. These are our secret sauce, right? That's what makes us the right people to work with. But that's not the way science works. Nobody can write a paper and be like, hey, got these cool results, trust me, right? I mean, we just don't. And there's no reason not to publish your results and your methods. I disagree with them on this, and I've had a lot of arguments with companies about this stuff, but that's fine. But those are the kind of things. If they're peddling neuromyths, if they're giving you some crap about, left brain, right brain, or you only use 10% of your brain, or, all those kind of things that you see, that's also a really clear sign that you need to look at what they're doing with a grain of salt. I can send you the link, or perhaps I can give it to Habiba and she could just share the blog post, but.
Yeah,
Yes,
so
that'd be great.
yeah, exactly. So if you can actually send it to me, Joan, then I can send it to all of the attendees.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I see some questions in chat too. Some good ones, actually. Can I take those in reverse order?
Go ahead.
So Haley said, do you suffer from imposter syndrome during your career? And if so, how do you get past it? Yeah, tons and tons I've suffered from imposter syndrome. There are so many times where I've had almost a sort of out of body experience and think, how did I get here? and what the hell am I doing here in this situation? And it happened a lot when I moved to the UK, just because I guess everything was new to me, and I was doing more neuro and was a computer scientist and thinking, this is a total example of being an imposter. But it still happens. Like sometimes when I'm talking to business people, and the brilliant thing about it that I love, but is incredibly stressful, is that when you're talking to them, they just take things with a very different grain of salt, and they ask questions that they see are linked that I might not see as linked. So they can ask you anything because they see you as the scientist, right? And you have to be confident enough to be able to give a decent, plausible answer, or say, look, honestly, I've never thought of that. I don't know. I'll just get back to you, which I'm perfectly happy to do. But I try to link it to something that's interesting, that's related to their question. And those are the instances that I've never felt more like an imposter. I've been in business meetings and, like conference rooms around a board, and they ask you something and you just think, holy crap, they're asking me about, memory and childhood formation and sleep. And I think, yeah, maybe I read a paper once, but I'm certainly not an expert. But it doesn't matter because you're more expert than they are. And as long as you can be honest and try to link it, they like that. And of course, if you actually don't know and follow up with them and say, look, I looked into it and here's what I found out, they like that even more. So I've kind of gotten over it by putting myself in those situations more and more, just to jump into the pool and get past it. Right. I mean, when you're in graduate school, you get tested. You've got your upgrade, you've got your Viva, you've got all, once you're an academic, you don't get tested in those same ways. But working with corporate tests me on a regular basis. I would say that happens to me a dozen times a year at least. And it terrified me at first. And now I've gotten to the point where I love it, just through practice, I guess. So that might be slightly nuts, but that's my answer. And then Nicholas said, can you tell us a little bit about the projects that most interested in at ACN? So this is the little corporate consulting group that Daniel and I do. And God, they've been, I think Daniel probably talked to you about the underwater nightclub experience, right? So I won't do that one. Let me see. We've done so many projects, and normally they start with a wackadoo question. Like those three things that I said earlier about like the tiger and pudding and celebrity chef streaming are all legit questions that I've had. They are, none of those ended up becoming projects for us, but the pool one that Daniel talked about earlier with Desperados was like, can you prove that crazy parties make people more creative? And it's just, you look at this email and think, excuse me, I can do what? But that was an awesome one because the answer was, yeah, we could at least figure out how to test it. Almost all of these things start with, can you prove something that they want to prove? And it took me quite a long time to learn how to say no in a way that they found understandable. So my inclination would be to say, look, well, that's just not what scientists do. We don't prove things. We can investigate things. I can test it, and it may or may not be the case. But they didn't quite get that. And what I had to learn was, if you frame it in business speak, they understand it really, really well. So for instance, if I respond to that question now by saying, look, my brand is a UCL neuroscientist. Scientific integrity is really at the heart of what I deliver. So we can absolutely test this, and we can do it in a rigorous way that we could potentially prove it, but it might disprove it. And I can do that for you. And if it proves it, great. And if it doesn't prove it, that's what the data show. And that's me being true to my brand. If I go against that, then I'm giving up my own personal integrity. And they get that. They totally. Now, neuroscientists or any scientist hears you talking about your brand and wants to puke, right? It's not the way we speak. But learning the right framing for these things makes a big difference. I'm trying to think. We have a project that hasn't come out yet that's coming out at the end of this month that was actually incredibly fun, where we had a company ask us whether or not addressable TV ads were more engaging than other TV ads. And I didn't even know what the word addressable TV ads meant. They just mean something that's targeted to an individual or a family, as opposed to something that's just randomly showing. So Daniel and I did this, this experiment. As I said, the results are coming out, I think, in 11 days. And the answer was, surprisingly, the ads that were more relevant to people, people remembered better, they engaged more with them, they liked them better, they showed greater physiological response, they showed greater external focus to these ads. I was absolutely shocked at how robust these effects were. So if, for instance, so one category of these ads were ads targeted at women. And women responded to them very differently than men did. But another category was cars. It was like people who like cars versus people who don't like cars. And your ability to remember these ads, if you're sort of a motorhead, is remarkable compared to, for instance, me, who I don't care about cars at all. All these ads look the same to me. There's a car driving down some pretty stretch of road. At the end, there's some like car logo. There's nothing to differentiate these things. And it was remarkable how people who are really interested in cars responded to these relative to people who weren't specifically interested in cars. So it's been fun because they ask questions that I wouldn't have thought to ask. They normally generate data that I wouldn't have access to on a normal basis. And of course, normally we have students who are involved in these projects as well, who are doing all the hard work and get the opportunity to see how what they do relates to how companies could use these data, which is very different than just simply doing a random TMS experiment in my lab, for instance. So I love those opportunities.
I actually can't see for some reason the questions, so I'm not sure if there are any more showing.
I can only see the chat, and
Yeah,
those are the two in the chat.
Okay, perfect. So my question to you guys is, does anyone else have any more questions?
Hi, Joe. Thanks for the talk. Very lovely to get such a personalized account. I mean, of your own personal career journey, obviously, especially since a lot of us listeners are now at a point where we'll be graduating from the social cognition program and kind of starting our own careers. So I think it's very relatable to hear your own ups and downs during that process. I guess I'm personally inclined to ask about PhDs and how when you ended up doing one and felt a bit out of your depth, like how could you tell a bit more about that, how you kind of dealt with that? And first of all, I think you might have mentioned, but how did you end up getting that as well? Because I'm currently in a situation where I'm kind of having to start this PhD application process, and kind of obviously there's a lot of projects that are for instance fully funded, or you could go with your own idea, but then that would mean, I guess, looking for funding, and sometimes it feels that the funded ones are kind of easier to apply to initially, but obviously there's more competition if they're fully funded as well to begin with, but they're kind of ready projects that you're just going to jump in on. So I guess I would like to hear, since it's personally relevant at this moment, I would like to hear a bit more about your thoughts on these PhD issues.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I did my PhD in the US, where the situation is slightly different in the sense that almost all of the science PhDs are funded in one way or another. So I was, very fortunate to get that teaching assistant post that lasted for a while, but not the whole time. Here, the number of funded studentships has dropped year on year, right? And so the research councils used to offer more, and then we also have some teaching assistantships, and I assume that that's characteristic of most programs. They must have some, but it's not that many, and it's something we've been trying to increase because we think that that's a really good way to invest in the future talent that you guys represent. I think you're right. I think that the question that you face is, do I want to just do whatever it is I'm specifically interested, find my own supervisor, and then try to carve that out, in which case finding the funding is absolutely the most difficult part, versus applying to something that maybe already exists, doing a 3-year PhD, just getting the degree, even if it's not exactly what you want to do. And it doesn't matter because then you're kind of in the club and you can do whatever it is you want after that. And that's a really personal decision for people. I would struggle to to do a whole PhD in something that I didn't really love, just because I think that if I'm not really engaged in something, I think that the sort of social and mental and other costs of doing a PhD probably would have ground me down, and I wouldn't have gotten through. You know, for me, when I was in California and we had no money, I lived near a beach and we just played volleyball all the time because it was outside and it was free. And that was one of the things that got me through grad school, which I think is another thing that matters. Like, you have to take into account where the program is. Is there stuff that will keep you happy and healthy through your degree? Because it is stressful. There are a lot of hard times and you will put in an enormous amount of work. And of course you will. But there are times when it wears you down, and it's good to have support around you. For me, that support was volleyball and my friends, right? And a sort of ridiculous commitment to barbecuing. But that stuff's important because it gets you through the really rocky patches. In the UK, one of the things to think about is corporate funded PhDs, right? So for people who have gotten involved in some of these projects with companies, particularly at a master's level, then there are these co-funded PhDs where the corporations pay a small amount, the government actually pays the rest, and that are underutilized pretty much everywhere. So if that's in any way feasible for you, and for lots of people it isn't, like they don't have a contact at a company that would be appropriate. But if it is, and for some people it will be, then that's something to also consider when it comes to funding. My experience with research funding for PhDs is that it's how you look on paper that makes the biggest difference to them, because there's so many applicants that they normally don't do much in the way of interviews. So anything that you can do to build up that CV, that give yourself those unique selling points, whether you're an author on a paper, you know, if you get a distinction in your degree, anything that's extra makes a big difference to giving you those opportunities on the funding front. And of course, if you can get into a doctoral training program, you know, something founded by either the Wellcome or the Leverhulme or the research councils, those are awesome. They give you a lot of opportunities for flexibility. You go in without a specific supervisor, you get to develop what your interests are, and then, you know, talk to different supervisors and do what you want to do. They're just hard to get.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was very helpful.
Good luck with it. And
you.
Everybody who's in that situation, I'm incredibly sympathetic.
Yeah, it will be needed. Staying optimistic though. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the way to go.
Any more questions, guys?
I think there was one, Nick asked one in the chat.
Oh. What are the most interesting fertile areas of consumer research for applying neuroscience? I'd say that the area that's most corporate at the moment is what's called copy editing. So testing advertisements to see how effective they are and whether you can adjust the advertisement based on the sort of information that you get from the neuroscience or whatever to make it more engaging. So a really clear and good example of this was a study that that Nielsen Consumer Neuroscience did with a charity ad for dogs. And it was one of these things where, you know, it was like, you should go to this charity and save a dog, right, that's been let go. And they had this incredibly cute dog, and he walks around the screen and interacts with you and things. But at the very end, they had the information about the charity written on the screen, but the dog was still walking on the screen. And one of the things that they did was they did eye tracking, just really where people's focus is. And they found that the dog was so cute that everyone was looking at the dog and not reading any of the information about how to contact the charity and what to do. And then they did a little memory follow-up with volunteers afterwards, and they found that the people who had seen the ad and were interested often forgot how to get in contact or even who the ad was for. They just remembered the dog. Whereas they then changed it based on that and did the end information verbally without the dog on the screen. And memory for the company and for the content of the ad and their contact details went up like 38% or something ridiculous. And this was just really simple use of eye tracking to measure visual attention. And it really made a big difference to how effective that ad was. That's the kind of thing that companies get. they can see financially why that makes sense and why they should put some money into it. So the largest area for consumer neuroscience is definitely copy editing. There are lots of other areas that are interesting: product development, employee experience, you know, like how do you do right by your employees? Can you reduce their stress content? Can you tell whether or not adding a foosball table in the workers' room makes any difference to employee stress and makes them happier? Well, there are different ways you can approach that as a sort of scientific question. Can you make better products and services? Can you improve consumer experience? I mean, Daniel talked primarily about consumer experience. And I think that that's another area. But the one that most companies focus on is almost all focused around copy editing. After that, consumer experience is probably second. And then after that, it's very, very small areas. But I suspect, I stutter. I suspect that this is something that's going to change a lot over the next 15 to 20 years as companies wise up, and as, you know, people with the skill sets that you yourselves are developing become more available in the real world, as it were, and work in these companies and bring the skills and knowledge that you have to solving some of these problems. That wasn't a good neuroscience answer, because that was kind of just cognitive science, eye tracking. But there are similar things going on with EEG, which is like the Japanese RL thing. And there's some very cool examples with fMRI that show that it's possible, but at the moment they all need replicating to see whether or not this is something that's robust and interesting, or whether it's just sort of a one-off kind of thing that made it into science and therefore needs to be shown to be true. So Nicholas has also asked about team and interactions to enhance team effectiveness. And yeah, this is part of that employee experience opportunities. So for instance, one of the things that's been looked at is what kind of interactions in a team stifle creativity versus the kind that create more brainstorming opportunities, and is it affected by, for instance, social interaction? So there's some cool work done with like people wearing basically monitors at work. It measures how close and how much time they spend with each other, and you can find out like whether there are certain core individuals that are important for groups, and if so, are those groups more effective than groups that are a little bit more distributed? So you can measure social interactions. But the other thing that you can do, and this is stuff that Daniel may have mentioned, but there's some cool stuff on the physiology of working in a team. And one of the things that you find is that people in teams that are more effective, and more effective can be defined in lots of different ways, but let me just use it broadly for the moment, tend to show greater physiological synchrony when they're working together as a team. So for instance, they're better at problem solving when it's constraint-based problem solving, if they seem to be a bit more in tune with each other. And you can literally measure this at their wrist using something like Apple Watches. So there's some very, very cool work done on teamwork and what makes it more or less effective. And similarly, there's some very cool work done that's kind of the opposite side of that, which is on leadership and what makes leadership more or less effective in different types of teams. But it's all really, really early days, and there's a ton to play for there. It's an exciting area.
So I actually have one question. It's a bit personal. So like there are a lot of companies that have spun out of labs. So Affectiva, for example, has spun out of the MIT Media Lab, and I see that there's a lot of interest from companies in that sort of area. Have you ever thought about maybe like expanding things out of academia a bit and just focusing on the business end of it, like having your own company or something?
Well, the ACN lab, the Applied Consumer Neuroscience, I just constantly call it ACM, excuse me, is a spin-out. It's a company that I started with a graduate student of mine named John Hogan, and Daniel's been involved with for years now. And we do consulting that way, as well as through UCL. It just depends on what the specific needs are. It helps, right? I mean, it gives more projects, and it's great fun, and it brings in some extra money too. But it's not something that I could replace my day job with and not starve. So I'm envious of those people who spin out and become unicorns and make billions. And I would like to know what the trick there is, because I clearly haven't figured that part out yet.
Thank you.
Hi, Joe. Thank you very much for the talk. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead. I could hear you, but then now I can't.
I think you're on mute, Lena. So if you just unmute yourself, we'll be able to hear you.
Yes, I'm unmuted now.
Perfect.
Yes, awesome. About your journey, and a big part of that was meeting people and sort of getting into places and meeting different people, because you never know what leads to what. But now it's not so much even to do with COVID, but I think somehow it more moves or tend to move all meeting to online. And I have a funny feeling it is not always so natural to sort of read a body language or bump in, and that same feeling that you get chatting and get to know people, maybe, I don't know, in a conference bar. It doesn't happen same dynamic in online. And my question is, do you think, do you know any platform or any way how to sort of create that kind of meeting place for academics and students and people who just want to educate, to create more of that energy and new ideas and, I don't know, almost world peace and all that stuff? Is there, could it be physical in any time soon, or it have to be online, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think that that's an awesome question. And I do think that's almost a question of our time. Because like for me, you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of my career has been influenced by just people I've met often randomly. And conferences, for instance, are a really good way to do that. I mean, a number of people who are my friends and are people I've made friends with as graduate students meeting at conferences, around posters or whatever, and they've stayed that way for life at this point. And even if we've never ever been really in the same area to work, we'd still meet up at meetings, and physically being with them was part of what made that work. It's my big concern about these kind of things, and about teaching this year, right? I mean, I feel like I worry that the students won't have the same opportunities to make friendships and meet people, certainly in the school environment. Hopefully around it they will. There are these platforms that try to encourage breakouts. So the best person to ask for this is actually Daniel, because almost every time I speak with him, he's showing me another one. Last one I'm trying to remember was Mentimeter. I can't remember what it was that was so exciting about Mentimeter, but there was one that he showed me that was like a video game, in the sense that there was a spatial layout where you create a room with various tables and whatnot, and you have a character, and you can walk up to other characters, and you can only hear them when you're within a certain distance, and then you can start speaking to one another. But as you could walk away from them to other people, and it was almost like a sort of really, really poor man's Second Life for academics. I could, again, I'm happy to chase up what the name of it was and send it to Habiba, and maybe she can share. But I haven't seen any tools that I've been super impressed with. Sorry.
Thank you. But do you think there is place or need, and also money? Because if I think it's academics need to spend time where you maybe I don't know, upload documents, research, it all costs money. I have no idea who would fund it. But do you think there would be possibility for some kind of one central platform for all the different sciences disciplines come together, and if somebody looking for information or meet up people, there would be all those links together, and whatever your interests are, you end up in sort of a real science or real people, not physical maybe, but at least it's not a junk science, or it's not
Yeah.
I don't know, something fake.
Yeah, interesting point. Yeah, that's really good. To some extent, like Society for Neuroscience is kind of that thing for the field of neuroscience. The idea that you're going to get 35,000 people together, and if you're interested in cellular neuroscience or the way proteins fold or human behavior, they're all going to be there. So that I think suggests that there is an interest in that kind of thing. I personally found that meeting overwhelming. Like that was another imposter syndrome moment for me the first time I was at SFN, thinking, holy crap, I guess I'm not really a neuroscientist and I don't know what most of these things that people are talking about are. But there was this also sense of glee, like any area of neuroscience that I was interested in, I could probably find somebody to talk to about it right now. An online version of that would be interesting and tricky. I mean, so I suppose publishing is kind of what that's intended to be, right? So if you can go to preprint archives or you can go to PubMed or whatever, at least there's the sense of, well, it's been through some form of peer review. It's probably not schlock science. I mean, it might not be right, but it's gone through the procedures that allow me to assess it. Whether or not there'd be some sort of online version of that actually promoted interaction is an interesting question. I mean, the Frontiers journals were designed to do that. They were supposed to allow communities to discuss papers interactively online, but it just never took off. I think the answer is I don't know. I think that's a really interesting question. And the fact that these conferences, mega conferences, seem to exist suggests that there's an interest in that. The question would be how you would go from that interest to delivering it online.
Thank you. Because I think if it could be something like what we're doing right now, but every so often for different topics, because one is that you hear somebody to speak something about what they're very passionate, but also having that even possibility to ask questions, I think is a big part.
Yeah, absolutely. Questions are so essential, and getting that kind of personal interaction. And things like this are great because it's sort of a reasonable number of people, right? Whereas, if there are 25,000 people online, I don't know about you, but I'm probably not going to ask a question. So I think you're right, but it's labor intensive to do this. I mean, major props to Habiba and Malin and the others who actually put all this together, because it's a lot of work, and I've done things like this, and thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Well, on that note, we want to thank you for the really personal and inspiring talk and for your time. And I guess there is some light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe we don't see it at the moment, but there is. I just wanted to take this opportunity to advertise our next talk also. So it'll be our last one by Dr. Elizabeth Stoke on conversation analysis in the time of COVID-19. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Joe.
My pleasure. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Bye.